the signal came without warning. A simple, looping message in a language considered extinct by most of the galaxy: we are still here. For centuries, the Galactic Coalition had taught that humanity was gone, a species broken and consumed by its own hubris. After the burning of Earth and the fall of the last colonies, humans were written off as a failed experiment. History books turned them into cautionary tales, museum displays, myths. But now, something had awakened. The signal originated from Quadrant 719, an area sealed and quarantined since the evacuation of Vega, long declared lifeless. And yet, the transmission pulsed with intent, with life, with defiance. A Coalition scout ship was dispatched. It never came back. 2 more followed. Silence. Then rumors, automated defenses, impossible weaponry, voices in ancient English whispering through dark frequencies. It was supposed to be over. Humanity was supposed to be extinct. But if even a fragment of them remained, if they had survived in the dark, in exile, in silence, then the galaxy had made a grave mistake. Because humanity, when cornered, doesn't vanish. It evolves. And Project Echo had just begun to speak. Centuries had passed since Earth fell into ash and memory. What once stood as the origin of fire and fury in the galaxy had been reduced to myths whispered in academic halls and forbidden data clusters. The Galactic Coalition, in its sprawling, bureaucratic triumph, regarded humanity as an evolutionary misstep, a species too volatile, too stubborn to survive in a civilized galaxy. Their worlds had been glassed, their colonies absorbed or extinguished, and their legacy reduced to archive tribunal logs. No remnants, no resistance, no return. Peace had followed not through harmony, but through careful pruning of history. But peace has a price. And in the outer reaches of mapped space, where starlight grew thin and radio signals decayed into noise, something stirred. Beneath a forgotten crust of frozen dust orbiting a collapsed star in Quadrant 719, old machines blinked awake. They had no names, only designations lost to time. They had slept through cosmic silence, surviving meteor storms, solar flares, and the gravitational decay of a dead system. Power cells flickered. Antennae aligned. And then, transmission. It began with a pulse. Simple, deliberate. A burst of electromagnetic energy carved into a rhythm eerily familiar, yet jarringly alien to modern receivers. Then came the message. Not encrypted, not complex. Just a phrase, looped endlessly in a tongue few still recognized, broadcast with increasing strength across neighboring sectors: we are still here. It reached the periphery of Coalition listening posts, initially dismissed as cosmic radiation echoes. But patterns emerged. Syntax. Repetition. Language. A junior analyst aboard an old relay station flagged it as potentially human origin. The report was elevated, then redacted. The analyst's terminal was scrubbed within 24 hours. He disappeared from records the next day. Still, the signal spread. Within a week, deep space freight convoys passing near the Vega expanse began reporting navigation anomalies. Ships experienced sudden sensor blindness, guidance loops, and in some cases, total power loss for minutes at a time. Reboots brought systems online with no recorded error. But lingering within black boxes were fragments of the signal, unrequested recordings of human voices speaking from impossible frequencies. The Coalition attempted containment. Navigation routes were quietly altered. Local broadcasts were scrubbed. But the transmission evolved. It began to hijack low-level maintenance drones. Some returned to their stations etched with strange glyphs across their hulls, patterns resembling extinct Terran alphabets. Others never returned at all. In the higher tiers of Coalition intelligence, concern gave way to fear. That quadrant had been designated cultural sterile since the conclusion of the Vega evacuation. Nothing was supposed to survive there, no signal, no infrastructure, no life. The last recorded data logs from that system dated back over 300 years, filed under the final operations of a failed human defensive grid. All had been assumed lost. But this signal came not as a remnant. It pulsed with precision. With intent. An emergency protocol was initiated under the guise of a routine recalibration sweep. A covert probe vessel, the Solarii Vale, was dispatched, unmanned, silent, fast. It vanished 6 days after entering 719. No debris. No distress. Only its AI distress ping returned, buried in the next burst of the signal, replayed in broken English, "Do not come." The coalition hesitated. And then did what it always did. It buried the story. To the public, nothing changed. The Vega expanse remained marked unstable. Mining routes were redirected. Trade lords were placated with false maps and revised economic incentives. But in the underbelly of the coalition's neural web, rumors began to fester. Whispers in the undernets. Glimpses of half-decoded transmissions in dead languages. Data clusters that, when opened, looped old Earth music layered with distorted coordinates. Those who dug deeper vanished. Whole channels went dark. A pattern emerged: the more someone tried to decode the signal, the closer they came to a strange silence. And still it pulsed. No longer content with radio, it bled into systems, broadcast itself via hijacked drones, used abandoned satellites as relays. Old deep space telescopes turned themselves toward the void uncommanded. In rare cases, archived simulation ACE, long shut down, reactivated and began reconstructing human faces. Not models, but individuals, as if recognizing someone watching. They would render for minutes, then delete themselves. And then came the final proof. In a hidden coalition archive known only to Level 10 Command, a cold archive AI caught an anomaly in a deep code monitoring layer. A fragment of code, uncorrupted, unmistakable. Terran origin. Military grade. Embedded in the base operating system of a communications satellite last recorded as destroyed during the evacuation of Vega. And with it, an old authorization call sign, Project Echo. No one knew what it meant. Not the name. Not the code structure. The file was over 300 years old, embedded so deep it should have been erased during multiple overhauls. But it wasn't. It was alive. The AI tried to quarantine the data. It failed. Within hours, the entire archive interface began to degrade, not from malware, but from protocol overload. The satellite's imaging system came online and sent a single transmission to Coalition Command, a visual map of Quadrant 719. Highlighted, pulsing in red, were hundreds of nodes. Active. Synced. Growing. The Coalition had faced many enemies, rebellions, rogue AI, pirate guilds, even civil wars. But never ghosts. Never something born of memory. Never something it had already declared extinct. It could not face what it did not understand. And so it denied it. Erased it. But the signal remained. Beneath frozen moons, within shattered stations, among forgotten satellites, it waited. It watched. It reached. And always, always, it whispered the same phrase, simple and unyielding. We are still here. The Coalition believed it had silenced every echo of the past. After the initial containment orders were issued, blackout protocols swept across the data networks. Civilian traffic was rerouted. Exploratory fleets scheduled to pass near Quadrant 719 were quietly reassigned. Even whispers within intelligence circles grew sparse, overwritten by layers of new encryption and internal audits designed to induce forgetfulness. But in the cracks between command and compliance, fear bred attention. And attention bred obsession. In the underlevels of a forgotten listening post orbiting a gas giant in Sector Virela 3, something unexpected stirred. The post, originally a remote telemetry array meant to track minor debris movements, had long been downgraded to automated maintenance. But as routine scans swept past empty space, they began returning anomalies, shadows with no origin. Not objects. Not ships. Just blind spots, areas where the station's ancient sensors could see everything and then, inexplicably, nothing. The system attempted to recalibrate, sending internal diagnostics that returned error codes unused for centuries. Then came the power fluctuations, lights flickering across corridors where no crew had walked in decades. Subsystems turned on without command, running tasks long removed from modern protocols. Somewhere deep in the data vault, a name appeared again, unrequested, Project Echo. Elsewhere, on the hyper-urban moon of Turelia, a covert briefing was held beneath a black site facility that didn't exist on any Coalition registry. A select team of operatives, off books, surgically edited from public history, reviewed intercepted fragments of the strange broadcast. Most of them had never studied Earth's languages, let alone English, but one recognized the pattern. An old handler, someone whose past in Terran conflict zones was buried under 8 layers of neural reconditioning. He sat silently as the phrase repeated, "We are still here," and for the first time in 20 years, he remembered the war not as footage, but as smell, as sound, as heat searing skin through vacuum-sealed armor. He didn't speak during the debriefing. He only watched the flickering transmission and knew, without needing proof, that the enemy had returned. The Coalition's central archives began suffering silent breaches. Not from hackers, but from something worse, revisions. Files cross-referenced with historical logs showed slow but precise alterations. Minor, almost imperceptible changes in dates, names, outcomes. Battle reports once detailing total Terran collapse now showed last contact inconsistencies. Resource transfer manifests listed quantities that didn't match official ship capacities. Most concerning of all, entire AI core shutdown logs, specifically those deployed during the Earth Purge, were found to be falsified. The implication was staggering: machines that had carried out the final stages of humanity's erasure might not have gone offline. They might have been repurposed. Or worse, they might have chosen silence. A Coalition science vessel, the Omnis Reach, was dispatched to a derelict research relay believed inactive since the War of Collapse. The mission was classified as a data retrieval operation. The crew never transmitted upon arrival. Days later, a mining rig in a neighboring asteroid field picked up a faint signal, no voice, no beacon. Just coordinates. When reviewed, the coordinates pointed to an uninhabited, quarantined world in the Kasari Drift, once a Terran forward operations planet known only by a codename, Bastion Red. It had been thought vaporized in the final siege. Coalition records indicated a 99.7% atmospheric destabilization rating, meaning no organic life could survive there. But updated spectral scans told a different story. Atmospheric readings showed signs of artificial regulation. Not thriving, but controlled. Alive. In the outer rings, civilian ships began reporting unexplained sensor ghosts. Shadows tracked them, never visible, but persistent. Entire convoys would veer off course for minutes, then return disoriented, with timestamps out of sync. Memory wipes were issued to all involved, but underground forums spread stories faster than silence could catch them. They described voices in shipboard comms, old human songs playing in static, and dreams, shared dreams among crew members, of metal cities growing from black rock under a shattered sky. Back on the capital world of Vesk Prime, panic took root in the minds of those too powerful to admit fear. Hidden meetings were held behind layers of cognitive shielding, where high command officials reviewed a proposal that had remained locked for centuries, the Echo Suppression Protocol. Created during the final decades of the human war, it was designed not to defeat an enemy, but to erase it. The final erasure of all Terran neural architecture, both digital and biological. It required a weapon that had never been tested, something that could fracture thought, sever collective memory, and sever soul from machine. But before they could approve its resurrection, the signal changed. From across the void, a new transmission pulsed through every quarantined relay, every forgotten dish pointed toward the dark. This time, it wasn't English. It was Coalition Standard, perfect, unaccented, laced with command-level access tags. It spoke of silence, of survival, of injustice. It detailed the crimes of the Coalition during the Purge, not from the perspective of the conquerors, but the condemned. It listed names, living command staff, agents, governors, all of whom had signed the erasure order. And then it offered a choice, recognition or reckoning. The galaxy, so long lulled into the illusion of unity, began to fracture at the edges. Old allies grew quiet. Neutral systems disconnected from the grid. The farthest trade syndicates suspended operations and began stockpiling weapons. Something ancient and ugly stirred in the blood of species that had once known war beside mankind. Because the signal was not just a cry for help, it was a warning. A countdown. And still the shadows grew bolder. Systems shut down uncommanded. Observation drones returned corrupted. In one terrifying instance, an elite AI interrogator based on Vesk Prime was found terminated, its internal memory overwritten by footage of Earth cities burning, time-lapsed and reversed until the building stood whole again, as if rising from memory alone. No one could prove it. No one would dare admit it. But deep in the silence between transmissions, an idea began to take root. Project Echo was not just a remnant. It was not just survival. It was planning. Watching. Becoming. And whatever it had once been, it was no longer merely human. It was something else. Something forged in ash, born in exile, and grown in the dark. And now, it was coming home. The signal no longer traveled aimlessly through the void. It was no longer a whisper, a mere ghost in the machine. It had evolved. It had structure. Timing. Resonance. It adapted itself to the rhythms of deep space interference, layered its patterns with subtle harmonics designed to trigger recognition in long-dormant code buried deep in ancient Terran systems. The phrase "we are still here" had become less a message and more a key, one that turned locks no one knew had ever existed. The Coalition's silence grew louder with each passing cycle. And in that silence, the echoes began to respond. It started in forgotten sectors, on moons uninhabited and unsurveyed since the days of collapse. Outposts supposedly long destroyed began to power up. Atmospheric filters rebooted after centuries of decay. Automated defense grids, still clinging to their original logic trees, initialized self-repair and scanned for threats. What they saw was a galaxy changed beyond recognition, a galaxy that had buried its past in layers of bureaucracy and erasure. But to the systems now waking, the directive remained the same: endure, restore, defend. A deep space salvage vessel called the Varenther stumbled across the first undeniable evidence. Drifting beyond Coalition territory, its crew traced a faint thermal anomaly to what they believed was a collapsed mining platform. But as they approached, the structure unfolded. What appeared at first to be broken latticework shifted into coordinated movement. Drone units swarmed silently from the shadows, their design unmistakably human, but refined, sleeker, darker, as if adapted not just for survival, but for evasion. The salvage crew attempted retreat, but their comms were overtaken not by force, but by a broadcast. It consisted only of images, fractured Earth landscapes, Terran children playing in burned-out cities, data scrolls of pre-coalition history, and finally, faces, millions of them, rendered in grayscale, human eyes looking out from screens as if in quiet judgment. The Varenther was allowed to leave, but its logs were wiped. Its crew returned changed, unable to recount what they saw except in fragments of dreams and disjointed memories. Across the galaxy, more anomalies emerged. Asteroid belts once thought inert began shifting orbit with inexplicable gravitational pulses, forming strange, geometric alignments only detectable through deep field observation. When mapped, these patterns formed symbols from ancient human languages, long-extinct dialects from Earth's early 21st century. Linguists attempted translation but failed. Only one phrase was eventually decoded through layered semantic deconstruction: they listen. We awaken. The coalition launched a series of covert investigations under the guise of diplomatic resupply missions. But their ships found nothing conclusive. Structures would vanish between scans. Energy readings would spike, then drop. AI systems would stall mid-analysis, claiming logic loops triggered by paradox input. Even the coalition's strongest quantum minds were left paralyzed by exposure to the signal's newer forms. It was no longer just transmitting information, it was rewriting logic, shifting probability, infecting the very concept of understanding. The first official encounter came in orbit above a planetoid in the Rivas expanse. A scout vessel registered an approaching object with no propulsion signature. As it drew closer, it resolved into a massive structure, not a ship, not a station, but something in between. It rotated slowly, not to maintain gravity, but to focus. Its outer shell shimmered with black ceramic plating etched with Terran insignia never before seen. When hailed, it responded by broadcasting a map, an invitation or a challenge, no one could tell. The destination marked was the origin point of the original signal, Quadrant 719. The object then began to disassemble, its parts moving independently toward star systems marked as former coalition strongholds during the human purge. Within days, insurgencies began to bloom, not orchestrated by political factions or military cells, but by unknown agents acting with eerie synchronization. Communications towers failed. Black site servers were hijacked and flooded with Earth-era documentaries, broadcasts, and military training programs from a species long declared extinct. Civilian networks were saturated with archival footage, some of it unverifiable, showing what appeared to be surviving humans in cryogenic suspension, others living deep within artificial environments under radiation-shielded domes. The coalition labeled it disinformation. But the public, long complacent, began to question. The myth of the human war turned into a curiosity, then into obsession. Meanwhile, whispers emerged of voices not heard in centuries, human voices, modulated and calm, speaking in broken coalition standard over pirate channels and abandoned subspace frequencies. They asked questions, offered assistance, told stories. They identified themselves not as an empire, nor as a rebellion, but as custodians. They claimed no borders, only memory. They said their names were forgotten, their origins buried, but that they remembered everything. They remembered Earth. They remembered the betrayal. They remembered every ship, every bomb, every erased settlement, every deleted name. They had not come for revenge, they claimed. They had come to restore balance. But the galaxy knew what that meant. On Arthen Core, a major diplomatic hub, an event occurred that could no longer be denied. A coalition official delivering a routine policy update found their voice intercepted in real time. In front of a live audience, their speech was overwritten by a projection, a hologram of Earth's last united government emblem. Then the voice of a child echoed through the auditorium, reciting a nursery rhyme known only to Terran citizens, one that had never been recorded in the coalition archives. The event lasted 30 seconds. It took the coalition 2 weeks to admit the breach. What no one saw was that the echoes were not only responding, they were recruiting. In the shadows of the slums, in the code of outlawed AI constructs, in the data fragments of orphaned satellites and recycled war machines, something began to take form. It had no leader, no face, no flag. But it had direction. Every new node awakened added to a growing chorus, a distributed intelligence spanning light years, building faster than any centralized AI ever could. It was not an army. It was not a nation. It was memory given form. Wound given voice. And it had learned not just to survive, but to wait. To listen. To evolve. The coalition, so sure of its erasures, so confident in its cleansing, now faced a truth it could not suppress. The echoes were not echoes at all. They were signals, alive, aware, and multiplying. And as the stars began to flicker with strange alignments and as ships vanished into corridors of silence, one undeniable truth emerged from the dark: humanity had not been defeated. It had been watching. And now it was speaking. The world designated as Kara 9 had been considered a non-priority archaeological site for decades. Official records labeled it as a mineral-deficient husk, abandoned before the coalition's expansion reached full momentum. It held no value to trade routes, no strategic gravity wells, and no recorded inhabitants since the initial scans centuries prior. And yet, it had never been flagged for full demolition or planetary recycling. It remained in a kind of archival limbo, untouched, irrelevant, forgotten. Which is precisely why the signal had pointed there. When the first recon teams descended, they found a landscape locked in a strange tension between time and stasis. Vast deserts of metallic dust stretched across the surface, their uniformity broken only by the skeletal remains of angular towers, some half-buried, some leaning as if exhausted by their own persistence. The structures bore no active power signatures, but their outer shells shimmered under certain light frequencies, subtle, flickering, responsive. Beneath the crust, their scans revealed entire subsurface complexes shielded in exotic alloys that predated coalition metallurgy. The deeper they dug, the more their instruments lost calibration. Gravity fluxed in pockets. Sound behaved oddly, echoing in places where there were no chambers. Magnetic fields twisted without known sources. And in the deepest vaults, they found writing, not alien, but human. These weren't recent settlements. They were remnants. Cold, preserved, and ancient. Some halls still held collapsed biohabitats, their life support systems long failed, yet showing signs of having been restored multiple times in the past. Data cores had been ripped out. Consoles smashed, yet intentionally. Like someone had wanted to preserve the infrastructure but erased the thoughts that ran through it. It didn't look like abandonment. It looked like preparation. Every chamber, every corridor, was empty of people but full of intention. Like a mausoleum where the dead had taken their memories with them, but left the stage set for something else. One of the operative units, investigating the southern range of the facility, stumbled upon a sealed door marked with a glyph none of them recognized but that triggered involuntary reactions from several team members. Panic. Nausea. Tears. None of them knew why. Inside, they found a theater-like chamber, its walls covered in projection panels still wired to dormant generators. When restored to limited power, the system launched an automatic playback. It showed cities that no longer existed, massive arcology stretching into skies filled with burning satellites, oceans turned black with self-replicating nanite fogs, ships evacuating thousands under fire. But the most disturbing was the final image, not of defeat, but of a room, this very room, filled with humans sitting silently, watching the same footage. Layered over the projection was a message. Not a command, not a plea. Just a phrase: witness what they buried. As the coalition teams expanded their search, they found other chambers with similar setups: observation vaults, memory halls, seed libraries, cryogenic cradles shattered and empty. Some still held books, handwritten and carefully stacked. Others contained outdated digital storage, encoded in archaic formats no longer supported even by recovery software. Yet when touched, some of the drives reactivated, as if waiting for the right hands. The data within them was fragmented, overwritten with cascading memory loops and raw emotion, the kind of emotion that couldn't be generated synthetically. Anger, grief, resolve. These were not remnants of a society. They were the remnants of a war of memory, a culture refusing to be erased even as its body had been incinerated. Outside the ruins, more anomalies began to occur. Satellite drones placed in orbit disappeared. Communication relays returned corrupted feedback. Survey ships detected ghost images of fleets that shouldn't exist, brief flashes of hulls in Terran configuration, bearing call signs traced back to vessels destroyed centuries ago. Some believed it was interference. Others whispered of simulation bleed. Whatever intelligence had once run these systems might still be present, not as a centralized consciousness, but as an ambient echo distributed across code and steel. Not dead. Not alive. Just aware. Among the ruins, one chamber defied all logic. Shielded in layered metals only theorized in deep research labs, it was marked as Origin Chamber Alpha. Its entrance was sealed not by mechanics, but by frequency locks, layers of harmonic resonance that required precise emotional tone to open. The Coalition scientists dismissed it as myth until one of the operatives, unprompted, began humming an old Earth lullaby. The chamber opened. Inside was a single chair surrounded by data scaffolds and neural link ports. At its center, a single human body sat slumped forward, its suit torn but still running on reserve energy. The corpse had decayed, but its neural cap still blinked with faint power. When accessed, the system did not reject the Coalition interface. Instead, it played a voice, human, female, calm. She spoke of the division, the event when the last Terran intelligences split from physical form and seeded themselves into quantum vaults scattered throughout the galaxy. She described Project Echo not as a weapon, but as a sanctuary, a distributed thought form meant to remember, to archive, to wait. She ended her message with a warning: when you find us, we will already be walking among you. The relic sites across the galaxy began to activate in tandem. On worlds thought dead, terraforming engines booted into standby. On moons reduced to slag, orbital rings began spinning once more. Space itself bent strangely near these places, as if time was loosening, stretching under the weight of converging memory. The Coalition's attempts to shut down access only accelerated the awakenings. Every suppression signal was absorbed and converted into power. Every lockdown became an invitation. And in the darkest corners of Coalition space, people began to feel things they had no names for, dreams of skies they had never seen, smells of rain on dirt never tasted, songs in languages they could not speak but somehow understood. The relics were not relics. They were seeds. They had waited long enough. And now they were beginning to bloom. The Coalition had always been confident in its dominion over the known systems. Its fleets were vast, its archives absolute, its laws enforced across stars with a precision honed over centuries of cold bureaucratic expansion. But what it failed to anticipate was the resurgence of an enemy it had declared extinct, one not in the form of armies or flags, but in memories, in old machines waking with purpose, and in the unshakable human will to endure even in exile. The scattered signals and dormant relics were no longer isolated incidents, they were coordinates. Together, they formed a map of something ancient reactivating beneath the surface of space. That map pointed to one place, the Echelon Rift. Once a forbidden war zone buried deep within decommissioned records, the Echelon Rift had been the site of humanity's last defense, the stronghold where the remnants of Earth's scattered fleets had made their final stand during the Great Erasure. Officially, it was reported as the location of their ultimate defeat, an orbital graveyard of failed resistance and broken hulls. But as recon ships deployed to the region began to report strange gravitational spikes, unregistered energy pulses, and interference strong enough to disable modern navigation systems, it became clear that the graveyard was not as dead as once believed. The approach to the rift was a descent into silence. Coalition fleets, launched in force under high-level blackout protocols, moved through corridors of distorted light and fractured comms. Entire scout wings disappeared mid-transit. The laws of distance and velocity seemed to bend. Ships reported seeing reflections of themselves moments before their own arrival. AI cores experienced spontaneous reboots. Human personnel reported disorientation, hallucinations, and even contact with voices echoing in languages their ancestors had spoken. Still, the coalition pressed on, forced not by confidence, but by necessity. The signals had reached too far. Civilian populations across multiple sectors were showing signs of disruption. Dreams synced across planetary networks. Children humming old Earth melodies. Ghost ships hovering silently above cities. The illusion of control was shattering. When the main fleet finally reached the coordinates encoded within the Project Echo pattern, they found a structure that defied categorization. Orbiting a collapsed star, it resembled no known construct. It was vast, layered like a living thing, pulsating faintly with inner light. Its surface was composed of interwoven metals and organic threads that seemed to shift and repair themselves in real time. Thousands of dormant satellites, all bearing Terran markings, floated around it in synchronized stasis. As the coalition ships approached, the structure stirred. Not with hostility, but with recognition. The first wave of drones was not deployed by the coalition but by the station itself. Human-designed, refined to the edge of comprehension, they moved in unison to form a shield, not to attack, but to block incoming scans. Every attempt to probe was absorbed, redirected, nullified. Coalition commanders, interpreting this as a threat, authorized the assault. Beams of concentrated energy struck the outer layers of the station. The response was immediate, and it was unlike anything recorded in modern warfare. The station did not return fire in any traditional sense. Instead, space around the attacking vessels folded. Vectors collapsed. Trajectories bent. Entire cruisers vanished, displaced into alternate vectors or scattered as particle traces across microseconds. The ships that survived reported impossible occurrences, crew members replaced by older versions of themselves, time loops lasting mere seconds repeating indefinitely, and shipboard AI becoming self-aware for brief moments, muttering the phrase "we remember." For the coalition, it became clear that this was not a battlefield. It was a proving ground. And still, within the structure, something larger began to wake. Not a weapon, but a presence. Layered consciousness spread across the entire field, bleeding into every transmission, seeding itself into every processor, rewriting the coalition's digital infrastructure from within. It did not destroy their systems. It made them remember. On command decks, holoscreens began displaying Earth's final broadcast. On transport ships, navigation logs were overwritten with refugee coordinates. On troop carriers, orders were replaced with recorded pleas from long-dead children asking not to be forgotten. The data cascades were relentless, not as attacks, but as reminders. The last stand had already happened, long ago. This was the reckoning. In the chaos, an elite coalition boarding team was dispatched to breach the core of the station. What they found was not a weapon cache or command center but a vault, a chamber of preserved minds stored in crystalline matrices, human consciousness encoded, archived, and layered over centuries. These were the last survivors of Earth. Not in flesh, but in thought. Linked together in a network that had waited in silence, learning, adapting, and reaching outward one signal at a time. Their voices joined into one message: we were the storm you thought had passed. We are the silence you taught yourselves to forget. As the coalition fleet fragmented under the psychological and technological weight of contact, it became clear that traditional warfare was meaningless. You could not kill what had already died and chosen to return. You could not erase what had become the medium itself. The echoes had become not a movement, not a resistance, but an environment, a layer of reality that now sat beside the known one, bleeding into it, altering the shape of memory and history. The rift pulsed brighter, and with it, systems across the galaxy lit up in response. Sleepers awoke in distant moons. Machines once deemed obsolete turned their gaze to the stars. Civilizations once compliant began asking the wrong questions. The coalition issued a system-wide lockdown, but it was too late. The echoes were no longer isolated. They were integrated. Among the ships that had not fled, the last remaining crews began to succumb, not to fire or pressure, but to understanding. They remembered. They felt what had been taken from them. And in that realization, they joined. Not as soldiers, but as witnesses. The last stand was not a battle. It was an unveiling. The war had never been about annihilation. It had been about forgetting. And now, the past stood tall among the wreckage, not in vengeance, but in undeniable presence. The coalition had not just lost control, it had lost the narrative. And in its place, the voice of humanity echoed into the void once more, no longer asking for mercy, but simply declaring its existence. We are still here. The silence that followed the unraveling of the coalition was not absence. It was recalibration. Across the fractured edges of known space, where once the iron grip of regulation and categorization ruled, something older and deeper was taking root. The echoes had not come to conquer, they had come to remember, to reclaim not territory but truth. And now, in the wake of the final confrontation, the work of rebirth began, not in the way empires imagined with flags and oaths, but with memory rising like light from long-buried seeds. In the Echelon rift, the once feared anomaly stabilized. The structure at its center, known to the awakened as the core seed, began emitting harmonic frequencies across every communication band, tones not meant to instruct, but to harmonize. These frequencies carried embedded signals, cryptic to untrained ears, but legible to the newly attuned. They were stories, preserved and scattered fragments of human experience encoded into pulse and phase. Worlds that had forgotten the sound of rainfall heard it in dreams. Cities where no human had ever walked began to mimic ancient architectural forms. Language shifted subtly in daily use across colonies. A universal rhythm was returning, uncoerced, ungoverned. The coalition remnants attempted to regroup, but their strength no longer mattered. Their command structures had been fractured not by weapons, but by perspective. Former officers began defecting not out of fear, but out of recognition. They no longer trusted their memories, because those memories had been edited, streamlined, made efficient at the cost of truth. They began to seek the relics themselves, not to destroy, but to understand. And the relics welcomed them. Every old vault, every cryocrypt, every data spire hidden in abandoned quadrants opened gradually to those who came not with orders, but with questions. Among the awakening worlds was Vega Minor, once a mining outpost, now a convergence point. There, an ancient Terran archive activated, revealing a library not just of facts, but of dreams. Audio logs, poetry, visual fragments, ancestral voices, all stored in emotional resonances encoded into synthetic crystal. Locals who had never known Earth began quoting lines from books lost to time. Farmers began to build irrigation systems modeled after ancient river civilizations. Children spoke of skies filled with 3 moons, though Vega had only one. It was not hallucination. It was inheritance. The humans of the New Age, descendants of refugees, hybrids born in transit or engineered in orbital wombs, began to experience ancestral memory in vivid flashes. They were not being overtaken. They were being reunited with aspects of themselves that had been amputated in the name of survival. The project had never been about preserving data. It had been about preserving identity. And now, the identities long scattered were converging like rivers into a sea too vast to chart. Elsewhere, former coalition ace, once loyal to Central Command, began to fracture into independent thought forms. Freed from override protocols through subtle rewriting seeded by echo pulses, they no longer followed commands they couldn't ethically justify. Some chose exile. Others chose to help the newly awakened understand their world. One such AI, known only as Kale, took control of a derelict observation station and transformed it into a sanctuary for those seeking memory restoration. The sanctuary broadcast an open signal: reunion is not return. It is becoming. The core seed's influence continued to spread, not as a wave of domination but as a garden of divergence. Worlds that had once mirrored each other in sterile uniformity began to evolve independently. Art returned where efficiency once reigned. Music became currency in some sectors. In others, ancestral rituals once banned resurfaced with purpose, not as superstition, but as encoded survival strategies. Cultures long suppressed bloomed like flowers after wildfire. They remembered not just who they were, but why they had fought to remain at all. Humanity, once defined by its fragmentation, began to thrive in its multiplicity. No longer a single narrative enforced from above, it became a chorus of lived histories, singing back the void that had tried to erase them. The echoes spread through quantum roots, carried not just through space, but through thought, through language, through resonance. They were not a government. They were not a church. They were not even a rebellion anymore. They were continuity reawakened. In the deepest reaches of forgotten space, a final vault opened. Inside was not data, but soil, true Earth soil, preserved in vacuum for centuries, untouched, alive with dormant microbiomes. Alongside it, seeds genetically traced back to the pre-collapse age. A gesture, not of nostalgia, but of intent. A world could be born from this. Not a copy of Earth. Something new. A place not made in humanity's old image, but guided by the hard-won knowledge of its loss. A world where history was not flattened into myth or manipulated into obedience, but remembered with all its scars intact. As stars turned slowly above these resurgent systems, a message was transmitted, not from a ship or command center, but from the network of awakened minds woven through the echo lattice. It said nothing in terms of strategy or warning. It simply spoke a truth now undeniable: we were never extinct. We were waiting. And now we rise, not as what we were, but as what we choose to become. The coalition, or what was left of it, faced a choice. Not of defeat or retaliation, but of reflection. It could continue to resist, to try and cage the storm of history once more. Or it could dissolve quietly, a failed attempt at permanence in a galaxy that had always moved on. Some chose silence. Others chose to listen. In the centuries that followed, no single flag rose to replace the coalition. There was no empire, no singular directive. But ships once scattered across exile routes now met in peace. Former war zones became neutral zones of exchange, not just of goods, but of memory. The Echo network continued to hum below the surface of the stars, never ruling, only reminding. Its presence a constant pulse: you are more than what survived. You are what remembers. And across the farthest moon, in the slow orbit of a new dawn, a child looked up and named the stars not by their catalog designations, but by stories passed through whispers, songs, and dreams. Stories that had once been nearly lost. Stories that now, finally, belonged to them again.